Welcome to Organizational Communications Week 7. The readings for this week are split between two topics. One is listening and its importance, and the other two relate to brainstorming. Now obviously these two factors are interrelated in that the effectiveness of brainstorming is to some extent related to our ability to listen. But of course listening does have a dramatic importance in the rest of our lives other than brainstorming. In the early days of my entrepreneurial life, I used to go to trade shows on a fairly regular basis. And a very good friend of mine, who was also my marketing guru, was standing there with me at one of these shows in a quieter moment and said, "Now, why is it we do these things?" And I instinctively said, "Well, we want to generate sales." And he said, "Well, if this show doesn't actually generate as much sales as it costs to rent the booth, it won't be the first time." "No, why do we do these things?" Well, eventually, he said, one of the important things about trade shows is to listen. It's one of the few opportunities that we get to actually be in one-to-one contact with the people who buy our product, whether or not that's the end user or an intermediary. And I thought that was an interesting observation. The fact of the matter is that whether you're in law enforcement, whether you're in a non-profit organization, whether you're in a peacekeeping force, it's very seldom that you really have the opportunity to listen to what your customers or the stakeholders in your organization have to say on neutral ground. So listening is a particularly important factor, and I would put money on the fact that as you go up further up the management ladder, whether it's in a peacekeeping force or a non-profit organization, and certainly in a normal commercial organization, it becomes increasingly important to learn the art of listening. In the Embracing a New Era chapter, we look at the mechanics of brainstorming, the importance of choosing the team, for instance. On the one hand, we all like to work in an environment that we know, that we feel comfortable with. So it's very tempting to choose a brainstorming team that's comprised of people who are rather similar to you. And certainly it makes the process a lot easier if these people are also similar to each other. On the other hand, the problem with that is that when you come up with ideas, they tend to be very, very similar. So one solution to that is that you work on the notion of a team where you have a high degree of diversity, people from different ethnic backgrounds, maybe different religious backgrounds. Perhaps some people are known renegades while the others are highly conservative. All sorts of different ways of trying to achieve this. And the goal of achieving this is that when you request new ideas to be put on the table, you will get a high degree of diversity. Those different backgrounds, those different upbringings will all stimulate different ideas in people. As I say, the problem with that is, A, it can be quite difficult to manage. When you have a high degree of diversity, you will often get a high degree of discord. And of course, it's also that discord is a source of discomfort for people. So this is an area of great interest, and it's discussed actually in the third reading of the week. So I'm not going to go into that in any detail at the moment, but I just want you to be aware that when you're choosing the team, this is one conflict that you will come across. When you're choosing the facilitator, clearly that facilitator should be non-confrontational. This whole process of brainstorming should be one that is lively, fun, upbeat, positive. And a lot of that is down to the facilitator. People think that the process of brainstorming will sort of run itself. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. If you've ever had the misfortune to be on a brainstorming team or in a brainstorming session where the facilitator is not experienced, is not trained, has never really done it before, then you know that the end result can be rather disappointing. In fact, it can be negative. So choosing a facilitator is very important. It's preferable that this person should be unknown to members of the team. There is nothing more off-putting than somebody coming into the room who has maybe they're from the HR department or something like that, and in the back of people's minds, even though it may not in fact be true, you have this notion that somehow or other the information that you lay on the table for the brainstorming session is going to end up in your HR file. Well, nothing could be further from the truth in general, but the point is that just the fact that these thoughts are in the back of your mind can influence how you react in a brainstorming session. So clearly the facilitator should not be associated with any position of power in the organization. And generally speaking, that means that nobody should really know them. That can be quite difficult if you're trying to do this sort of on a budget, as it were. So you don't have to lay a few $1,000s on the table to get a trained facilitator. Nonetheless, it's important to do that, and if you are in a department that needs to generate ideas from time to time, you might come to an agreement with a totally separate department, perhaps a different organization, even if it's in the same field, that you get two people trained, one from yours, one from their organization. And when either side wants to do a brainstorming session, they use the facilitator from the other organization. Choosing the venue is something that is not given an awful lot of thought to, generally speaking. We generally find an empty room and that's it. It's not a very good idea because people's ideas are affected by the environment in which we are all eating, sleeping, sitting, working, and we want to try and get people into a different frame of mind when we're generating new ideas. Generating new ideas means treading down new pathways. It means taking leaps we don't normally take. And all these things are best done in an environment with which we're unfamiliar, and preferably an environment that is stimulating. When I used to do this sort of work in Las Vegas, there's a very nice library down there which actually had some quite good exhibitions of art from time to time. And that was a great venue because people didn't generally spend much time in that library. And it also meant that when we took a break from our brainstorming sessions, or when I sent people off on their own to do individual brainstorming, they could go and visit some of the artwork and just wander around, let it impinge on them. And there was always this sort of idea in the back of your mind that you're already in a creative environment. So then being creative becomes a little easier. So if you get involved in trying to set up a brainstorming session, you might want to think about alternatives to the room that happens to be empty. And is down the end of the corridor within your normal working environment. The extension to that also is that we're trying to get people out of schematic way of thinking. We're trying to get people out of their traditional knee-jerk kind of reactions to things. So changing the environment is one way that we can help achieving that. Your facilitator, if they're trained, if they're competent, will be establishing the rules of brainstorming. And I go into that a little bit in that chapter. Brainstorming, the initial idea generation phase of brainstorming should be totally non-judgmental. We can put all sorts of bizarre and apparently lunatic ideas on the table, and that's just fine. Should be light-hearted and fun. For lots of different reasons. We want people to look forward to a session like this and not sort of inwardly groan. Also, creativity is associated with positive affect. So in general, we are more creative when we're happy than we are when we're not happy. So we really want people to be of positive affect. And the amount of energy that people will put into a task is also related to the aspect of positive affect. So we want this to be light-hearted and fun, and that's part of the role of the facilitator also. And the rules as such should be clearly stated, but they should not be stated in such a way that people feel that they're repressive. Finally, I have chosen the third paper for you to read to be that of Cavadius and Summer, for two main reasons. One is that it goes into the issue of team diversity in somewhat more detail than I mentioned in the previous slide. And this is really very important, because if any of you have to put a team together that has as one of its goals the ability to be innovative or the ability to adapt to a changing environment swiftly, then the issue of team diversity is a critical one. And this paper will explain to some degree why that is. Also, for the other reason that I chose this paper is that it's quite an interesting overview of a discussion that relates to brainstorming effectiveness and efficiency. If you have ever been part of a brainstorming team, you may never have been told that it has some fairly serious limitations that have been shown up by research from scientists such as Deal and Struber that are mentioned in this paper. And when Alex Osborne actually came up with the brainstorming process, he had great expectations for its effectiveness. He was imagining that a group of people would be able to come up with sort of 5 to 10 times the number of unique ideas that those individuals would be able to do on their own. And the research into brainstorming that's cited in this paper suggests otherwise. In fact, the effectiveness of brainstorming as a team versus individually is often down to something like sort of 70%. In other words, if 6 people sat round a table, they would generate something like sort of 2/3 of the number of ideas, compared with if those people were actually on their own thinking up ideas. Now, this is not just numbers of ideas, of course, this is numbers of unique ideas. Anyhow, this research is from time to time is brought into question, and this paper discusses that. One of the arguments here is that the respondents, the participants in early research were often students, so they were being cued into being a sort of organizational environment, but they were not actually sort of organizational employees. The problems that they had to solve, or the new ideas they had to come up with, were really not terribly realistic from a real world kind of perspective, and more importantly, they didn't necessarily matter very much to the student participants. In other words, their lives and their careers did not really hinge around the solution of the problems in hand, and all these things would indeed have had some sort of impact on the quality of the research. Now, whether or not you're going to buy the fact that these issues will totally turn the results upside down is largely up to you. But this is an interesting paper to go through some of these arguments, to go into what brainstorming really is in this kind of context.